All right, let's jump into it. I want us to talk a lot, obviously, about what you kind of invisible learning. What is it exactly?
That is a great question. Shannon, do you want to take this one or you want me to take a stab at it?
No, I think I can kick us off maybe and get the conversation going. So, invisible learning for us is this idea of learning without even knowing that you're learning, which is the best way, I think, especially for adults, that we learn just through like connections. We learn in everything that we do. And I think it was a phrase that was coined many years ago, maybe 7 years ago now. Sammi and I were participating in a training, an ADT training that wasn't anything about invisible learning. I think it was about workshopping and having engaging workshops. And one of the instructors had mentioned the importance of saving space for invisible learning, just kind of mentioned it in happenstance. And it just really resonated with both of us. I think after we were debriefing on what we had learned and kind of processing it, we both noted that idea of invisible learning. And that really piqued our interest and got us started on like, what is invisible learning? How can you incorporate invisible learning into learning? And is there a space for invisible learning outside of workshops and maybe other types of learning? I don't know, Sammi, is there anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it on the head. It's really about this idea of you learn by doing, you learn in your workflow, and it's acknowledging that and then strategically thinking about how you can capitalize on those moments, whether that is in learning or organizational development or any of those spaces.
In comparison, how is it in comparison to traditional learning? Like in my head, traditional learning is this structured thing. There's training sessions, there's manuals, whereas it sounds like invisible learning is more of this, almost like this learning as you go. Am I on the right track there?
You are on the right track. It is really supporting the learners where they're at and how they're growing. Instead of asking yourself, how can I teach every possible scenario to support this person in whatever it is? How are they going to be in this scenario? And how can I help them when they're in that moment? So instead of teaching them, maybe it's a customer support training. Instead of thinking about it from, I must have this 2-hour workshop around every scenario regarding what they're going to run into when they're dealing with customers, it's how can I let them know where to go when these things are happening, give them some practice scenarios in a safe environment. And then as they are coming into those scenarios in their work, they have targeted spaces to go to, whether that is a mentor and they're shadowing, whether that is leaning on your knowledge base, whether that is having job aids. It's really leaning on some of those out of the classroom learning techniques.
Sounds like there's a collaborative aspect to it as well. You mentioned kind of leaning on like subject matter experts perhaps or mentorship as well. I even guess like peers, leaning on your peers to learn.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the primary things when we're working with companies that we talk about is how do we empower leaders, especially when it comes to like onboarding or performance? How do we get the leaders buy-in there? So they're the ones providing that coaching in that moment or helping a new employee come in. Or we lean on mentorship or professional coaching or the SMEs that are overseeing these different divisions. How can we help them communicate effectively when a protocol changes?
Yeah, I think I would add to it. So invisible learning is thought. So I think traditional L&D is like what you were saying, Podge. It's thought of as like this external thing that people are pushed to do, right? So they're pushed and meaning like I have to take this training or in order to satisfy compliance requirements, this is something that I'm doing, or it's this external space and this external entity that helps me to learn in my role. Invisible learning is more of like thinking it as internally, thinking of it as weaved into your day, learning in natural ways that we learn anyway. And I think that's a shift that the L&D industry is trying to make. I think it's a good idea to make that shift. I think it's more effective, especially the way that we consume information today. So although there's a place for that kind of still external component, especially with compliance trainings, classroom learning does work for certain subject matter, but the weaving it into your day does require like getting leadership involved, having mentors involved, peer learning. There's so much learning that goes on amongst peers that we can capitalize on just by adding a layer of guidance to what the day looks like.
This is kind of segueing towards my next question. But for our listeners there, they might want to know, why is invisible learning important for companies to adopt?
I would say that it's because invisible learning is happening whether you're thinking about it or not. It's so important to think about it and as you're thinking about your conversational flow or your workflows, because you can create all these protocols and procedures and trainings and all of these things. But if in those moments where people are actually learning, like when they tap somebody on the shoulder and say, what does this actually mean? Or how do you do this? If you're not thinking about that scenario, that's what they're going to be learning. And so they might learn the wrong thing if there isn't guidance there. And that's how you start to develop poor cultural habits. And those are really hard to break over time. So really strategizing and incorporating invisible learning moments helps you reduce the amount of bad habits you have to break over time.
In addition to that, too, I think most companies want to grow and progress. And in order to do that, learning should be incorporated into the culture, right? That's how we grow. That's how we progress. And in order to incorporate learning into your culture, this is something to embrace. So it's like so much more than this external entity of learning, but it's more like part of who we are. This is prioritized in our day to day. This is prioritized in our culture, in the way that we function as a company. And I think that's what helps companies thrive instead of survive, right? When it's already built in to how they function.
So in a way, there's obviously a heavy investment when it comes to training, learning and development within companies, but companies might ignore then how people are actually learning on the job. It's separated where the traditional method we'd say could be, I know I'm speaking a bit binary, it could be separated, but what you're trying to do is it a way of like merging the traditional or just having an understanding that these moments are continuing, not just outside of like the classroom environment?
Yeah, I would say too, it also releases a lot of weight from L&D teams and leadership teams and trying to create content for everything. And instead, it's like, okay, we don't need to create content for everything. How can we empower our team to learn without structured content? And so then you can prioritize the content that is the most impactful. So you have less content, but you have a more empowered team with lower costs.
I think there's definitely more bang for your buck when you are planning for this idea of invisible learning versus that traditional, oftentimes bringing in third-party contractors to provide training. So I think it's definitely more bang for your buck for companies whenever that you set up your learning in this way versus traditional.
That one clicks with me because having a background in teaching, in schools, we'll say the students don't just learn from textbooks. They actually learn as well from working together or figuring things out, collaborating, even making mistakes too is important. And it's the same in the workplace, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like those concepts don't change. There's literally 120 different ways that somebody can learn content. And a lot of them come from learning in a safe environment, failing in a safe environment, practicing it, like just doing the thing or talking to somebody about it. And those work in the classroom and they're leveraged a lot, especially as you get older in the classroom, whether it's high school or collegiate work. But all of that still applies to adults as well.
And leaving space for that is so important too. I think we're talking broader picture here, but to bring it into a micro image of what this could be. For example, if you are onboarding somebody, let's say, it's like, what does this look like in action? Like, how does it actually play out? I think there might be a concept that you might with the leadership to help focus on for, let's say, 1 week. So for 1 week, if you're a health coach, for 1 week, we're going to focus on your listening skills and being a great listener. So you leave room in that week that's the focus, and then the leadership is supporting and checking in on and making sure that the employee is having the space to focus on listening. And then also, if they're failing at that space is still okay because we can keep working on it throughout that week. So just something like that is an example, I think, of what we're talking about, and leaving room for that invisible learning to happen too.
Speaking of an example, have you seen this or seen invisible learning in action inside a company? Have you brought it to a company at any point? Is there any sort of success story that you'd like to share?
Oh man, I think so many examples of when we haven't necessarily targeted invisible learning and it just happened anyways. And we were like, okay. But there were also moments where we strategically targeted invisible learning and it paid off. I think a big example for me is one of the companies that I've been working with, we've really focused on communicating cross-functionally and learning from each other and learning about the ways our work impacts others around us. And you can't really teach that in a classroom. What has come of that is meeting regularly and creating that space for people to just share. Here's what I'm working on. Here's what I'm prioritizing. Here's my questions. How about you? And then creating that space for the conversation of like, oh yeah, no, here's how I'm thinking about that. Let's align on that together. And that creates growth and understanding and learning as a team.
I'm reminded of our beginnings whenever you ask that question, Podge, because Sammi and I were part of a team that brought learning and development to Noom in the coaching space. And when we first started, we were very traditional in our mindset. And we thought we had to build out every possible scenario. Like we thought we had to build out a training for it. And then within the training, we had to build out every possible scenario within that subject. And we had trainings. It's funny now, but we had trainings that had thousands of words and so many modules because we thought we just had to make sure we covered everything so that everybody knew exactly what they had to do, right? It wasn't working. It was so much work to create it and get it going and keep it updated, but we weren't seeing the results that we wanted to see. So it was whenever we took a step back and really reflected on this idea of what's a better way that we can create experiences where the learners can learn. And the programming that we built when we first started compared to the programming we built when we moved on was completely different because we incorporated all these different methods of invisible learning. We incorporated small learning groups. We incorporated mentorship. We incorporated individual assignments and spaces that they could complete throughout the week. And we really built connections with leadership there. And how can we get leadership involved? It was definitely, so when you ask that question, that's instantly what I thought of is that like we had no idea what invisible learning was when we started and we created so much waste. But then from that we learned and we did build that out and it was a very successful programming there.
I think one of the pivotal moments there, this is like around the same time that we were taking this course, was the team had developed this very, very robust cybersecurity training that was going to be released to the entire company. I mean, we built out every scenario you could possibly think of. We built some really cool videos and some interactions, and we were like, this is going to be great. And then we definitely did not have the adoption that we wanted. And what was really great was, I think it was the IT manager at the time, sent out a phishing email to the team as like a test to see if they actually understood. And it wasn't until people fell victim to the phishing, like the practice phishing email, that it all started clicking for everybody and it became a topic of conversation. Everybody was talking about it in their groups. And that's when people actually started to learn. And that's when we were like, we should think about this differently. And we started to implement a lot of those social learning and peer learning type activities. And we focus less on building out for every scenario.
Pretty good example. And for those unaware, like phishing emails, it's PH instead of F. They're just basically emails sent by scammers to try to get you to click a link, which I am happy to say I did not click the link or have never clicked the link from a phishing email. So keep trying out there, scammers. You haven't got me yet, although they are getting scarily better. Have you heard some of the stories with AI where they can call you and it sounds like your mother or your friend and they're like, I need money quick.
Yeah.
It's scary stuff for sure. And it isn't until you're in that moment and you're like, this doesn't sound right, that you really learn it, right? But yes, you are a better man than I am. I have definitely fallen.
You got me thinking, right? Into like the traditional method, you probably have stakeholders or managers involved that are like, I want to see the completion rate. You might have a post-knowledge test to see have they hit 85 to 100% of the knowledge. How do you incorporate some sort of measurement? Like, how do you ensure that this invisible learning model is successful?
Oh, it's such a great question. I love this question because ROI is always on everybody's head. And traditionally, when you're thinking about how do we measure the success of a training, you think about knowledge check completion rate and did people complete it and are they happy with the training that we delivered them? And those are like good indicators of like, okay, maybe this was a good experience or maybe they started to understand it. But when we're creating KPI frameworks for teams, we really focus on more of the lagging indicators like performance over time, retention rates, employee churn, internal mobility. Those are far more impactful than the first, did they actually understand it in the beginning, because chances are they didn't understand it fully. It takes 30 days sometimes. It takes 90 days sometimes, depending on what you're targeting for it to really click. And so I argue that you should really focus on some of those more long-term metrics.
And in the meantime, you can still certainly measure confidence levels. You can measure adoption levels. Like, are they actually doing the work? You can talk with managers and assess like where they're at. So there are still ways to assess those kind of short-term goals and short-term measurements. The long-term is where most companies want to see the numbers for sure.
You've mentioned leadership quite a lot. I presume buy-in is obviously vital. Do you encounter resistance in that area?
I think so. And I think the resistance comes from time allocation. So leaders are like, well, I have a lot going on. And so sometimes having more meetings with employees based on their learning goals is more on your plate in that sense. But again, I think the way that I try to get the buy-in is how it helps the manager in the long run too. So there's a lot less need to manage long term if you're managing up front in that way. And so I don't think it's long-lived resistance that you get. I think it's really a conversation or two about what it looks like, about how we can incorporate it in, about leaving the space and being okay with it, setting those expectations up front. And then the buy-in is there because leaders want to have employees that don't require a lot of micromanaging, right? Like you want to be able to build them up. You want to be able to help them gain all the skills that they need to be successful, because then it's successful for the manager as well.
And we definitely target leadership first. Like when we're first coming in, one of the first things we want to talk about is what we call our growth culture blueprint. Are you aligned that this is something that is important to you? And what is your principles? What's your mission? What are your feedback cycles? How do you guys approach adaptability? And when you start having those conversations with them, they start to realize like this is something that is important if they haven't already realized that. And then it is just working with them to figure out what is the best way to support y'all and also support the employees that we're trying to help grow, and realizing that that impacts the growth of the whole organization.
That's so true too. Like oftentimes when you're coming in, people seek out learning and development typically when there's a problem. Like L&D will be the solution to this problem that we have. So I think sometimes that leaders are hungry for what we can bring to the table too, because they are looking for a solution or they are looking for a better way.
You're kind of playing on the question that I did have as well. It sounds interesting to me that if you're coming in, we'll just say you're consulting, right? So you're going into an external company to support them with an L&D initiative. So I'm working at the company. I sit down like you're giving a presentation or a Zoom call or in person, and then you start talking about culture. I'm probably going to be like, wait, I thought we were talking about L&D. Even before you mentioned culture, I was thinking, is there some sort of pre-cultural assessment or pre-cultural work you do? And the reason I said it is because if you have employees, we'd say, who act under fear or stress of just being caught or making a mistake, I would highly guess when they go in to do a training, they are not going to learn as well as someone or as a company who has, you kind of mentioned, mindset, like a growth mindset, kind of going back to education with Carol Dweck as well. If the company has a growth mindset mentality and is able to accept mistakes or in ways maybe promotes like they're just part of the learning process, I could see two totally different companies there for you going in working with. So you do some sort of pre-cultural assessment.
Absolutely. Like the first step is realizing that learning and growth is tied to your culture, and it is tied to the connection within your culture. Those two things can't be mutually exclusive, because you're right. If you have a culture where there's a lack of autonomy or a lack of trust, when your leadership team is saying, hey, everybody is going to take this training or everybody's going to focus on this skill, their immediate thought is, oh crap, how are they going to measure me on this? How am I going to be tested on this? Is this going to result in me getting fired? Versus, yeah, no, this is a great place for us to grow. Let's do this. Let's experiment. Let's have fun with this and see where this goes. Totally different experiences. So that's why one of the first steps, like I said, we're talking about this growth culture framework. The first step to that is an organizational needs assessment. We're like, where are you like shining right now? Where are you struggling? And that's where you target those learning initiatives. It's often not the initial thought of we need a training for this. There's usually an underlying root cause that you need to address first.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's probably a good place to go. If you could provide a framework, if someone wants to work with your company, what steps do you take when you first get in contact with them?
The first things that we're looking at is, how does your team approach change? Do you have principles? Do everybody know what your principles or core values are? How do they come into play in your work? How does your team prioritize? How do they communicate with each other? What's your team structure like? What are your feedback cycles? Do you have feedback cycles? What do you do when something goes wrong? How do you guys approach it? Those are some of the things that we ask them. We ask leaders, and then we also request to talk to employees as well to get both perspectives.
Sometimes companies think they know what they want, and I'm agreeable to that for sure. Like, we want to listen to what you think you want and what you think that you need. But then once we get in there and can get curious and ask some questions, then that we get a little bit of room to maybe really diagnose what's going on, which oftentimes is something, again, deeper. We think of, again, L&D. I think Sammi and I take the perspective of L&D is more about organizational development than it is learning and development, like at its root. Sometimes when you get in, get curious, start asking some of those questions, then it's easier for a company who thought they needed something to see that maybe they needed something else, and that we can work with that and we can help with that. Because for us, again, learning and development is part of the culture. It is organizational development.